I'm James from Future Voices podcast. Today I'm meeting with Andrew Pack, child protection lawyer at Brighton and Hove City Council. In our work, getting the legal perspective is essential. Here's what Andrew had to share. So I think we met probably about 10 years ago when I took, when I started in Brighton as the adolescent team manager. And at that time, we were working around what the local authority response could be for sexual exploitation, but we were also looking more broadly than that at wider adolescent need. And at that time, my team had quite a strong interface with the legal teams. And I was interested from your perspective, what's taken place over the last 10 years in respect of exploitation and applications to the courts when we're thinking about our options to safeguard children.
Yeah, so I think the challenges for people working with adolescents and for adolescents generally are just so much greater than they were when the Children Act was put together. So in 1989, I was thinking about this the other day, there wasn't any radicalisation in 1989 because there just wasn't ISIS and Al-Qaeda and those sorts of things, and radicalisation is something that's really been an issue for adolescent pods to face and adolescent workers to face and children to face, that they're being exposed to social media, they're being exposed to content, their views are being informed by the things they see. You know, if you sit on YouTube long enough, you get more and more extreme content coming your way. And if you're young and impressionable and your mind is in the process of forming, then the stuff that you're seeing on YouTube is very unfiltered. You know, in 1989, when the Children Act was put together, there was no internet. So the worst stuff you could see, you'd probably have to be sort of sending off money to a post office box in Holland or something and getting your material back. And you would have to be actively seeking that out. If you wanted to be exposed to disturbing imagery or disturbing information, you'd be taking a conscious decision that I'm interested in that, I'm going looking for it. Whereas now it's on your device, it's on your phone, it's being pushed towards you because the people behind the big tech companies, engagement is everything. Keeping your eyeballs on the screen is everything. Getting those clicks, getting those retweets, getting those likes, getting those comments is everything. And the best way to do that, to monetize your platform, is gradually more and more extreme content. So the stuff that you can see on the internet, the stuff that you can see on YouTube now is far, far worse than anything that you could ever see in the 1980s. You know, in the 1980s, we were obsessed and having tabloid scares over video nasties. And if you've sat and watched one of those video nasties now, you'd be astonished at how tame it was. And you could only get that if you were going into a video shop and you looked 18. You know, you wouldn't be able to see it otherwise. And that stuff was pretty tame compared to what we've got now. And we don't really have a solid idea of what exposure to that is doing to young people's minds at critical stages of their development. You know, we all know about neuroplasticity and how influential exposure to material can be at various stages of a young person's life. But this is like, social media is a petri dish. We're going to find out in 10 years' time how bad this really is and what difference it makes. So when the people who framed the Children Act in 1989 sat down to do it, they had no idea about the internet. It wasn't even, computer geeks weren't using the internet in 1989. That would probably be about 93, 94. So it wasn't something that a bunch of lawyers and judges and retired judges had in their mind at all. So you've got the internet, you've got radicalisation, which is closely tied into it. You've got the whole issues around self-harming. We had young people who would be attempting suicide. That's something that has always been around, but self-harming and the culture around self-harming is just completely different now to how it used to be. So back in the sort of mid-90s when I was a writer, I was on a writing website, and part of the thing we would do on there is people would make submissions and say, send in the writing that they were doing, and you would put it on the internet for people to look at. And just out of nowhere, over a 6-month period, I went from having no poetry about self-harming to about 30% of the content was about people expressing very vividly and in a lot of detail how they felt when they were cutting themselves, what they were doing it for. And that was like, wow, this is just a part of the world that I had not ever seen before, and there's so much out there. So that, again, wasn't something that the people who framed the children out were thinking about. When we were thinking about, in 1989, children being involved in gangs, I mean, firstly, they weren't really gangs, they were just groups of troubled teens. And secondly, the sort of things you were worried about children in gangs doing were maybe glue sniffing, maybe vandalism, burglary. If it was an organised criminal gang, it would be burglary, pickpocketing, that sort of thing. When we talk about criminal gangs now, you're talking about very, very organised individuals basically going, we can use children to carry drugs for us, we can use children to sell drugs for us, because when they get arrested, they're not going to probably do prison time, and therefore they're not going to be motivated to inform on the people higher up the chain, and they're easily pushed around, they're easily bullied, they're easily intimidated. You can easily get them into a position of financial dependence of, firstly, the lifestyle that selling drugs can give you is way better than working at McDonald's if you're a young person. And secondly, the drugs get confiscated by the police or from somebody in a gang pretending not to be in the gang, and suddenly, oh, now you owe us £2,500. What are you going to do for that £2,500? Well, whatever you tell me to do. So criminal gangs are so much different than they were in 1989. You're talking about now young people carrying knives, at risk of being stabbed, being told, go here, stab this person, do this, get these drugs, sell these drugs. That's just completely different from what we were thinking about in 1989 when the Act was formed, which was sort of what you would describe now as pretty low-level offending that probably you wouldn't even look at. If a referral came in about this young person's smashed a phone box up, you'd be like, okay, what else? That's the nature of pressures for young people is so much greater than it ever was. You know, if you were young in 1989, you probably knew the people in your class and maybe another class if your busy friends were in that class. So you maybe knew 60 people. And you could compare yourself to those 60 people and you'd be like, I think I'm popular roughly in the top sort of quarter, or I'm not very popular, I'm in the low quarter, I'm good looking, I'm good at sport, whatever, but you're comparing yourself to 60 people. Young people now aren't comparing themselves to 60 people, they're comparing themselves to thousands of people. They're comparing themselves to everybody on the internet. And also everybody on the internet is able to come and say, I'm going to give you my opinion unsolicited, whether you like it or not. This is how good looking or ugly or rubbish the thing that you're passionate about that you've decided to put on your social media. You know, I make pots, I do poems, I express myself creatively. There'll be loads of people on the internet that are supportive, and you can get that real sense of community there. But there are also pretty evil, sick individuals that delight in nothing more than making people feel bad about themselves. You know, that phone in your pocket is a dopamine dispensing machine, but it's also a negativity dispensing machine, and unsolicited negativity. So it's probably no surprise that we're seeing depression, anxiety disorders much more frequently in young people than we ever did. And that's a combination of firstly recognising it and us living in a society where you're able to talk about it now and vocalise it, and also the pressures that people are under. You see sometimes on social media sort of memes of people saying, oh, when I was at school, we didn't have anybody with ADHD and anybody with autism. It's all a modern invention. It's like, well, yeah, but you did have Gary that knew every single dinosaur that ever existed and wouldn't talk about anything other than dinosaurs, didn't you? So you just didn't know that he was autistic because you didn't have the labels and the recognition and the understanding for that. You just knew that Gary was a little bit unusual. You knew plenty of kids that just could not sit still in class and would be constantly disruptive and being thrown out, and eventually just stopped coming to school because nobody recognised ADHD, nobody recognised Asperger's in the correct way to actually help these young people. We just marginalised them. So there's all sorts of pressures on young people these days that just weren't there at the time. Like, you didn't really have the language or the space for young people to talk about sexuality or gender identity. You know, if you were at school and you were anything other than binary and het, then you knew very well to keep your mouth shut, basically, because otherwise you were going to have a hard time. So again, I think it's great that there's a space and an understanding and an acceptance that you can talk about these things, and that's better than the secrecy and the marginalisation of young people. But it brings its own complications in sort of speaking about it and teasing out and finding your own way in life. So just so many pressures affect young people now that weren't around in 1989. And we've got a piece of legislation that we all work to help and support young people that probably needs an update and a refresh. But that's a massive piece of work, and I don't think there's any political motivation to do that. So professionals working with adolescents are just trying to do the best they can. And if I sit and listen to this podcast in 5 years' time, I'll be saying, well, why haven't you talked about so-and-so? That's a huge issue. Well, it's because we don't know yet. We can't anticipate what's going to be the next thing that's a challenge that we just didn't even countenance. I think I probably took one of the first radicalisation phone calls as a lawyer in the country, and I was like, young people going off to fight in a war overseas. What the hell? I'd had no language to process it. The understanding of like how can that possibly be happening? I just did not conceive of it before it actually happened. It was not something that was on my radar as even a possibility.
I think
really long, wasn't it? Sorry.
No, I think I was part of the team at the other end of the call.
Yeah.
You're describing the landscape having changed radically, and it made me think, particularly in the context, as you say, we may look back in 5 years and we're having a discussion about something that we've not mentioned today. I went back to a chapter in a book that was published in 2004, I think, when I was looking, and essentially it was talking about county lines, but the language is different now. Yeah. And the conversation is different, but actually we're looking for something, or we're looking for a description often of something, or more understanding of something that actually someone's already identified, but it's called by a different name. And it was really a stark reminder for me around a lot of the forms of harm have been in existence in some areas, but we've not recognised it, and we've not given language to it. We've not created space for people to consider how they're going to respond. And what interests me is the impact that that's had on the legal system. When practitioners are looking at, we've got a child who's been impacted in multiple ways, as you've described, and they are faced with a circumstance where they think that child is actively suffering significant harm. It's outside of the family in the main, and the decision making can quite often be, well, what can we do to stop this child being harmed? And often it's at that point when people start to look at, do we need to restrict liberty if we're not able to enact sufficient safeguards around that person, or disrupt those that are causing harm, if indeed that is being actively considered?
Yeah, so I think that's always a difficult situation and it's one of the most challenging areas of social work, I think, that when you're dealing with very young children and the harm is being perpetrated by the parents, there's a really obvious route through that, which is that you work with the parents very rigorously and in a very sort of directional way about identifying exactly what needs to change and helping people make those changes. And if you can't make those changes, then we need to look elsewhere. And care is never a panacea for any child. The outcomes for younger children are immeasurably better than the outcomes for adolescents in care. We know how bad local authorities generally are as corporate parents for adolescents. You can look at all the information that's out there. You can look at exam results. You can look at mental health. You can look at the number of young people that have been in care as adolescents and criminal offending, prison sentences. And that's not to say that that's your destiny as an adolescent, that you can't go into care and thrive and you can't go into care and do well. But when you've got so much evidence that care for adolescents, particularly troubled adolescents, is not that great, and it's a difficult experience, and we're not really at a point where we're always doing more harm than good in care, then it becomes a difficult decision about, is there anything we can do short of putting this young person into care, and particularly short of restricting their liberty, because that's such a counterintuitive thing for a social worker to want to do. We're here to help children, we're here to engage with children, we're here to make young people feel safer and more secure and better about themselves. But here we are saying, okay, you don't get to go out when you want. You're living in a place where there's a front door and that front door is locked and you can't come and go as you please. And as soon as you start thinking about the lived experience for a young person in that situation, it's just unthinkable to think that if when you were 14 or 15 and you were expressing however your difficulties were, that somebody would have come along to you and said, we're going to lock you up for that. In nicer terms, they would have said, we're going to have to restrict your liberty for a little while to give you a safe space in which to grow and change. It's still like adolescents aren't dim, and particularly the adolescent cohort that we're dealing with tend to be probably a bit more intelligent. That's some of the thing that I found in secure accommodation applications. The children that we were dealing with were usually very bright, and they were struggling to find ways to channel their skills and their intellect, and they were going into difficult areas. But they're going to figure out, this is basically, you're locking me up, you're punishing me, you're saying I can't do this and I can't do that. And there may be good reasons for it, because we're trying to keep either you safe or the general public safe, if you're talking about people that are out committing knife crimes or that are potentially going to be the victim of knife crimes. Sometimes restricting your liberty is what saves your life, or what saves the life of somebody else, or saves you doing something when you're 14 or 15 that's going to change your life forever in ways that it's going to be really hard for you to come back from. It is fundamentally a good thing and the right thing to do in that situation, but you completely understand why professionals would agonise over it and say, I don't want to do that if I can avoid doing it. And then you start looking at, well, can I affect change by the adults around them that are doing this? And that's obviously harder than it is with parents of young children, because their parents of young children are firstly much more in charge of the care that they're giving to the young parent. If they're not providing that child with suitable clothing for school, then there's something they can do about that. If they're, I'm not providing good enough care because I'm, as a parent, abusing drugs or alcohol, you can try to stop abusing drugs or alcohol or manage in a different way. But parents of adolescents that are challenged and showing challenging behaviour might well feel, I'm doing all I can, I'm at the end of my tether. You look at all of the evidence from the Rochdale inquiries, and these were parents that were very often trying everything they could. They were speaking to social workers, they were speaking to the police, they were saying, my daughter is being given expensive gifts by these older men, being taken away by these older men, being groomed and manipulated by these older men, and I'm telling them that they can't go out, but they climb out of the window. You know, what can I do? I'm putting locks on the window and they smash the locks, or they just don't come home from school. What can I do? Those weren't parents who were being feckless or careless. They were just gripped with something that was, at the time, pretty incomprehensible. Nobody professionally really had a good understanding of it, and professionally nobody had a good way of dealing with it. So asking parents to make changes is harder the older the child gets, and also often the people perpetrating harm on a child isn't a parent. It's your criminal gang, it's your grooming gang, and they're not receptive to come into the office and have a sit down and we'll talk about this, and we'll have a family group conference, or please sign a written agreement saying that you won't ask John to sell cocaine on the streets for you anymore or carry a knife. They're just not going to come to those meetings. They're not going to sign the written agreement. So how do you engage with them other than just constantly saying to the police, I've got this information, is there any chance that you could, nick the people involved? And it's more complicated than that from a police perspective. I'm sure at some point you're going to sit down with a police officer dealing with adolescents, and they will have a very different perspective.
I am, and we're talking, there's a lot of conversation at the moment around the need for legislation around exploitation, and certainly in the work that I've been involved in, we've talked a lot about the use of the Modern Slavery Act, in particular where young people are identified as victims of the Modern Slavery Act, but they may be identified through criminal activity initially. Wanted to go back to what you just articulated, which is essentially that the parent doesn't hold the balance of power in a situation where they can't put in place, as you described, techniques that will keep their child safe despite their best attempts, because those that exercise the power over the child sit externally to the family home. And in the legal system, when applications are coming through, how is that presented, or how should that be presented?
Okay, so I think people will be aware that before the local authority can gain any court order or make an application to court, the first thing that you look at is the threshold criteria met. And there are two limbs to that. First is that the child is suffering significant harm, and then generally is that harm attributable to the parent who's not providing care that you'd expect a parent to provide. Mm-hmm. In a situation where the parent is at fault by, I'm not really properly controlling or attempting to control my child's movements. I'm not engaging with professionals who are trying to reduce that risk. So I'm not willing to come to meetings and talk to social workers about risk management strategies. I'm not. My philosophy is, this child is 14, she can do what she wants. If she wants to stay out all weekend and not come home, and she wants to go partying with 30-year-old men, then that's fine with me. She can do what she likes. But I don't think that's most parents. I think that's a really tiny subset. So you're talking then about, well, there is significant harm occurring, but it's not because the parent is doing anything wrong. It's the harm is coming purely from external influences, external factors. That's where you would be looking at beyond parental control, which is the second limb of the threshold. And you really only use beyond parental control for adolescents, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And what you're talking about in beyond parental control is the child is suffering significant harm because the parents aren't able to manage and control and protect them in the way that they would want to. And the courts have said you don't have to attribute blame on that. So you don't have to say it's the young person's fault that they're beyond parental control. They're not beyond parental control because they're a menace or awful. It's a fact. They just are. And you don't have to say about the parents, this child is beyond your control because you are ineffectual or weak or lazy. It's just a fact. And that's particularly relevant because often in a situation like this, when the child is in local authority care and the local authority being corporate parent, the local authority isn't stopping them or isn't able to stop them running away or taking drugs or having sex with people that are far too old for them to be having sex with. And we don't say the local authority are causing this child significant harm because they're corporate parent and they're not stopping it. You say that the child is suffering significant harm and it's because they're beyond control. And that's, if that keeps happening, that's where you start looking at restricting liberty or secure accommodation. So in terms of legal tools, the tool is there to say this child is suffering significant harm from beyond parental control. That can trigger a Section 47 investigation. That can trigger an application to court. That's the tool. The issue is, well, what are you going to do with an order if you get one? Why do you want one, and what are you going to do with it? So the care planning is the difficult bit. Unfortunately, as a lawyer, that's not the bit I have to do. I have to just say, do you meet the criteria to go to court and get an order if you want one? What you decide you want to do with that order is up to you, really. You know, I can help and guide, and we can have conversations and discussions about what I think pragmatically will work or not work. But I'm not a social worker, so I don't care plan. Sometimes you get drawn into it, but the division of labour is social workers decide what the plan is going to be for the child, and I say to them, this is how, using the tools available, we can try to deliver that plan.
There's two really important points there. The first one, I think, is, for me, for children and families, whether or not it's been explained in the way that you have, what we mean by beyond parental control. And the way that you've described that is that this isn't something that is apportioning blame, that the reason that that child is beyond parental control is through fault of the parent or fault of the child. In my experience, that's often not clearly explained to families. The other thing that you had talked about as well is the child suffering significant harm? And that's my starting point, certainly. And there's a difference of opinion sometimes with regard to what then should happen. So certainly in my experience across the country, I've been presented with different views where somebody will say the parent isn't responsible for the harm, and therefore that doesn't warrant a child protection response or a Section 47. And yet, in my practice and in the discussion we're having, the starting point is that child suffering significant harm, yes or no? And if it's yes, then the secondary point is that due to the parents, or is it because the child is beyond parental control, but the threshold is met?
Yeah. So I think a good way that I would look at this is to go to Rochdale. I'm not singling Rochdale out as this is the only place in the country where this is happening. It just happens to be where the public inquiry happened and where the scandal broke. So it's shorthand for this issue. So in Rochdale, there were criminal gangs who were deliberately targeting young women and adolescents, and worked out a very systematic way of abusing and manipulating them in order to sexually abuse them. And it was a particularly difficult thing for professionals and the police to grasp and deal with, because I'm going to pick my words with care here. There was perhaps a feeling that the girls were complicit in their own abuse. Mm-hmm. And that sounds awful. Mm-hmm. And it is awful. But there was a feeling that these were not girls that were being abducted from the street and bundled into cars and taken to a place where awful things were happening to them. Mm-hmm. These were girls that often were, if you would talk to them, would be describing the abuser's men as, this is my boyfriend. And leaving their homes or leaving school voluntarily to go and spend time with these adult men who had been grooming and manipulating them. And then from a boyfriend, and I'm doing air quotes here, boyfriend perspective, after a period of time of making that young person feel safe and trusted in their care, they would then expand. But if you love me, you'll have sex with my friend Barry. He's really lonely. He's really sad. He needs he needs someone to look after him, and you do so much for me, and if you love me, you would do that. And that's a horrendous Rubicon, but that's how it was happening. It wasn't Barry turning up in a van and snatching these women and having sex with them. It was a very systematic and calculated and manipulative grooming technique. And at the time that Rochdale was happening, and as I say, it was happening in many other parts of the country, it wasn't geographically limited to that area. That's just where it broke. So I'm using Rochdale as a shorthand always. There was a feeling within professionals of, well, what can we do? These young people are choosing to do this. They are putting themselves in harm's way. And also probably the numbers that they were dealing with was just like, we can't intervene on all these young people because there were such a volume of young people that were finding themselves in this position. And some of them very early on wanted out and were seeking help and were receptive to help. And some of them were, I'm so deeply manipulated and groomed or frightened or scared of reprisals because they were being told this is what happens to people that speak to the police, this is what happens to people that stop spending time with us, that they were very resistant to professional engagement. And so I think what sort of broadly happened was a culture of, we know this is happening, but what can we do? A sort of shoulder shrug. And you might have meetings and you might send letters, but nobody was really going, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and delve into what was a real cesspit of awful child abuse and deal with it. And I think we all recognise now that everything that happened in Rochdale was wrong. And, you know, you can read the public inquiry about the detail of why it was wrong. And we all understand now, if you get a referral about that sort of thing happening, that there's a process and there's a system, and we have to treat this as very serious. We don't any longer go, well, you know, she's 15, she's choosing to go and spend time with this 35-year-old man, but it's her choice. We don't take that view anymore, and we never should have done, but that's a pragmatic view that people mistakenly took at the time. But I still think we are there with teenage boys that are being drawn into criminal gangs and drug dealing. You know, I think there's
and girls.
And girls. I think there's a sort of a bit of a shrug of the shoulders and, you know, what are you going to do? This young person is just a career criminal that started early. They are obviously a bad person because they're out dealing drugs. Eventually the criminal justice system will catch up with them and deal with them. And what are we going to do? They're 15, but they are choosing this life. And the answer still is they're a young person. They're not in a position to make those choices. You know, you have to treat a 19-year-old that decides, somebody has said to me, hey, do you want to earn a lot of money selling drugs? Yeah, I want to do that. It's a different prospect to a 15-year-old. And probably biologically, brain development-wise, not all that different. But the law is a bright, sharp dividing line between you're 18 and you can make your own decisions in life, and you're under 18 and you're vulnerable and you need to be safeguarded from bad decisions, poor choices. You're not in a position to make that informed decision. But at the same time, the law is still going to come down hard on you. If I catch a 15-year-old with £2,000 worth of cocaine in his pocket, he's still going to face criminal consequences. So it's difficult, but I think that's always the best way to look at it. Is we learn a load of lessons in Rochdale about criminal sexual exploitation, and I think the profession has taken that on board, both lawyers and social workers and the police. We have taken that on board, but I don't think we've been able to transpose those lessons to child criminal exploitation, despite the obvious parallel. There's still a little bit of, well, you know, this 15-year-old is out there robbing people. He's out there threatening people. He's recruiting people to join his drug gang. He's selling drugs. He's going to to abandoned properties. He's in taxis going from Bristol to Portsmouth, and taxi drivers are accepting huge cash payments to drive people about in taxis at 3 o'clock in the morning and not asking questions. What? But, these things are happening because there isn't yet that huge public scandal of this is what's happening in this area. You get individual cases reported, but nobody's actually gone, this is how systemic a problem this is, and this is how systemic the failure of professionals to deal with it is. And when I say that, I'm not being critical of professionals because, as we've already talked about, there isn't an easy solution to this. The solution that we've got is when we look at the toolkit, if the young person isn't receptive to advice and guidance and boundaries, you're left with really, I'm going to remove you from your local area and possibly restrict your liberty. That's, you look in that toolbox and it's a sledgehammer. There's no finer detailed tools. If somebody is not receptive to advice and guidance and changing their behaviour on their own, then generally you're thinking about, well, I'm going to have to break this cycle and remove you from your social group who are causing you these problems, these older men who are criminally exploiting you. But in doing so, you are firstly changing where they live, where they go to school, the friends that they can spend time with. And secondly, in a modern age, you're always connected to these people. They've got your phone, they've got your social medias. They are going to be reaching out to you and saying, where have you been? You still owe me that £2,000. Don't think we've forgotten about it just because you've moved away. You're still going to be drawn back into that world. Or they're going to be like, oh, you're in Bristol now. Don't worry about that. I've got some people in Bristol. You can work for them and pay my debt off. So, moving children geographically isn't necessarily the perfect solution. I don't think that we've yet found a good solution, but that doesn't mean that we should not talk about the problem, because just going, I don't know, it's too difficult, there isn't anything, what can you do, is what we collectively did in Rochdale. And there wasn't a great solution in Rochdale either, but just going, I don't know, it's too hard, is not an answer.
It's interesting, the language around putting yourself at risk. That's where I came in, came back into management of adolescent services, and we worked hard to change that language. Looking at plans, quite often, while it's not said, the plan is reliant on the child thinking or behaving or avoiding things differently. So arguably, often our planning doesn't match what we've said in terms of our language, unless we're at that point where we come and say to you, actually, we think we've exhausted all of the options. We don't think we can enact sufficient safeguards around this person in the community. We think potentially we need to restrict their liberty. Yeah. Or we can find that we've enacted a care plan, often in good faith, that actually has restricted that child's liberty without the legal agreement to do so.
Yeah. So I'll pick up your first point, I think, first, because when you think about it in this way, it's quite extraordinary. If you took a 10-year-old that you were considering was at risk of physical harm from a parent, and your plan was to say to the 10-year-old, you probably won't get hit if you tidy your bedroom and don't answer back. So I want you to sign a written agreement to say that you're not going to answer your dad back, and you're going to do all your chores on time, and you're not going to be a nuisance, and you're not going to be lippy, and put the responsibility on that young person for avoiding the harm that's coming to them as a result of adults. If somebody suggested that to you in a meeting, you'd be like, you are absolutely crazy. That is not the way child protection works at all. Yet, as soon as we get into adolescence, we start thinking that that's okay to be like, you just need to be better. You need to make changes. You need to stop being harmed. Stop yourself being a victim. Stop yourself being harmed. When they don't even necessarily understand that they are a victim, they're just being manipulated.
That's a real challenge in practice, because sometimes I've seen people in good faith going to say, we need this child to understand they're a victim. For me, there's a step before that where actually we need to open a discussion where someone can explore their experience.
Yeah.
Because a lot of young people, in my assessment, are suffering harm, and in my assessment are a victim of exploitation. But that may not be their understanding at this point because of the grooming or because of their own experiences. And that can be a real tension that we're trying to intervene with.
Yeah, I think probably listening to the young person talk about what life is like for them is a more powerful and more successful approach than just going, you are the victim. Because if they don't see themselves in that way, then it's just purely, you're just trying to stop me living my life. You're stopping me doing what I want to do. And that's not going to be helpful. Whereas in discussing with them what their lived experience of a situation is, you're probably going to get more information and more use out of them, and have a dialogue which is much more two-way than didactical and just you going, you just need to stop doing this and wagging your finger at them metaphorically.